So as you might have noticed, I still haven't gone through the whole process of creating a game from start to finish, and this will actually be my first real task on this journey. My challenge is to create a fully functional game in 1 month. Hi everyone! It's been 1 week into development. The game's foundations are laid, and I'm very excited to share my work with you. If you haven't seen my previous video, make sure to watch it before. It introduces this new series of devlogs setting up the scene. And without further ado, let's roll back in time to when it all started, which is 1 week ago. So, every good game starts with a player, right? And in this game, the player is a dog. Look at this good boy. So I started by animating the dog movement in the 4 directions, and something's missing here. Yeah, that's much better now. The shadow makes it feel much more anchored in reality. So after the movement, I added a simple idle animation in the 4 directions. Oh, cutie little tail. And after writing a quick movement script, here we go. He seems so happy, but there's something missing. This is a shepherd game, right? So we gotta add sheep. And 1 sheep is probably not enough for our dog to feel fully alive. I then decided to dive in my new A-star pathfinding asset documentation. And yeah, that was a lot to take in, but I eventually wrapped my head around it. So I implemented the flee behavior on my sheep, pressed play, and yeah, it's working. It's working, yeah. Guys, this was a very simple proof. I had to start thinking about sheep AI. This is kind of like the sheep's brain. So I started with a very simple AI. The sheep is constantly checking if his distance to the player is smaller than a given threshold. And if it is, then he should better start running away. So let's test. And yep, they now stop before reaching the end of the map. So let's make this AI slightly more complex. How could I reproduce the sheep's herding behavior? I started by implementing a simple aggregation behavior. So if the sheep is not fleeing, he will compute its distance to the closest sheep, and if this distance is bigger than a given threshold, then he should be aggregating towards this closest sheep. So let's add more sheep to test this behavior. Alright, that's enough. Okay, let's test. And yeah, they seem to be running back towards the closest sheep. They're still fleeing, but they seem kind of robotic, just standing there and eating. So I added a roam behavior that would trigger if they're not fleeing or aggregating. And as you can see, they're just picking a random point around them and going towards that point. That makes it feel much more lively now. And I think that wraps it up for day 1. I was pretty happy with my first day. I started with literally nothing, and I now have this dog running around and bothering sheep. Day 2 was all about refactoring, but we'll get to that later. I first started by adding simple obstacles and adapting the pathfinding asset to take these obstacles in consideration, and as you can see, this worked out pretty well. The sheep are effectively avoiding the obstacles, they're not blindly running into them. I was pretty happy with that. Now to the refactoring part. So what is refactoring? It's a big word that means a lot of things. You're basically taking a piece of code and doing modifications inside it in order to make it cleaner or more scalable, which means it will be easier later on to add some new features, for example. And why is this frustrating? Well, mainly because before and after refactoring, the result in the game is exactly the same. So as you can guess, it's not an easy task to show you the direct impact of what refactoring does on my game. For example, here it allows me to easily change the sheep AI parameters, like for example the sheep trigger flee distance, and I can tune this really high up, or on the opposite, I can tune this really low, making the dog a minor threat to the sheep. But the main outcome of this refactor is now the ability to add multiple flee targets to the sheep. For example, let's take a random prop, like this scarecrow, and we can add this to the flee target list of my sheep. And they will now behave with the scarecrow the same way as they behave with the dog. So day 2 was kind of frustrating because, as I told you, Refactoring doesn't change your game at all, but it's something we developers do a lot if we want to make it on the long run. And being able to add a fleet target that easily is a huge upgrade. We will see that in future days. So I wanted to implement a bark that would scare the sheep more than just the player movement, but as you can see, this didn't really go quite as planned. Okay, so I fixed the bug, and well, this is starting to look like something, and I added some sound effects for my dog bark. And of course, sound effects for the sheep. Hey, that's my studio name! Headphone users, lower your volume. Okay, that is way too saturated. I'll fix that later. First, let's build a pen. This pen will allow me to test the game's feeling when I try to lead the sheep in the pen, which is basically the game's objective. Alright, I'm so excited to try this now. All this effort... Oh, shut up, you sheep! All this effort to lead to this one moment. Okay, this seems more complicated than I predicted. Alright, let's speed things up a bit. Alright, there's a lot of work left. So the first thing I did on day 4 was to create some invisible points in the pen, and when the sheep enter the pen, they'll automatically go towards these points. That makes it much easier to keep the sheep inside the pen once they're in there. I then started to work on the UI with a basic progression bar that represents the amount of sheep that are left to be led in the pen. And that surprisingly worked out pretty well. So I kept working on the UI with a basic timer, and there is a very handy animated clock in the Mini Fantasy asset packs I could use that fits the job perfectly. And again, that worked out great. NANI? Day 5 was all about implementing the wolf, and as you can see, that didn't start really well. He was switching targets every frame, so that led to a new kind of epileptic, the wolf. But after a few tweaks, I was pretty happy with the result. The wolf acts pretty natural, running around the herd and keeping a safe distance from the flock. Alright, that's all nice and fun, but a wolf is here to eat sheep. But just like every time I try to implement a new AI system, this doesn't go as planned. Okay, let me explain you a few things here. The number over the sheep represents the amount of sheep in a radius around them, so that's kind of like their herd size. And the wolf will attack the sheep only if they're isolated enough from their herd, so in this situation, when the number over their head is less or equal than 2. Okay, so now that the wolf attacks, let's make him eat the sheep. Okay, that's maybe a bit too much. Look at this greedy wolf. So I made him take a break between 2 meals. But something still bugs me out. The attacks feel shallow. I need to add more juice. So I started working on blood splatter particle systems. Blood splatter, I said, not fireworks. And of course attack animations in 4 directions. And there we go, that's exactly what was missing. Of course, I really enjoyed that day. Designing and implementing the Wolf AI was overstimulating for my brain, and trying to make the attacks feel juicy was also very enjoyable. At the end of the day, I really felt like I accomplished something. But I couldn't call it a day without trying this. If you enjoyed this first devlog, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe to my channel if you don't want to miss the following devlogs. There's going to be one new devlog every week for a total of 4 or 5 devlogs, and by the end of them, if everything goes well, you should be able to play the game. I'm very happy with my first development week. Starting from an empty project and slowly filling it with its protagonist is extremely satisfying. I'm having a lot of fun and I can't wait to keep building on it. So see you next week and prepare to press play.